Encounters as Sources of Meaning, Remembering Dr. Robert Barnes. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, colleagues, and Congress participants, I would like to begin this presentation by extending a warm welcome to all of you and thanking the organizing committee of the Viktor Frankl Institute for inviting me to offer this talk in honor of Dr. Barnes. I am Maria Marshall, a registered psychotherapist in Ontario, Canada, Mignon G. Eisenberg Professor at the Graduate Theological Foundation in the United States, and founder and co-director of the Ottawa Institute of Logotherapy in Ottawa, Canada. On July 6, 2021, we received the sad news that Dr. Barnes passed away. He was my teacher, professor, mentor, friend, and colleague. He was a towering example of humility, grace, wisdom, and resilience. It is therefore an honor for me to talk about Dr. Barnes and my encounters with him, offering you a little glimpse of what it was like to be a student of Dr. Barnes and what were the life lessons that I learned thanks to this experience. In anticipation of this present Congress, Dr. Barnes phoned us on May 13th to invite my husband Edward and myself to be featured speakers at this conference, which we readily accepted. At that time, my presentation was going to focus on encounters as sources of meaning, the meeting between Viktor Frankl and Sigmund Freud. We had no idea that that conversation will be the last one that we will have with our dear Dr. Barnes in this life. As requested by Dr. Patricia Starck, I reformulated my original presentation to include details about my memories with Dr. Barnes. It is a blessing to recall examples of our collaboration, which started with me being accepted as one of his students at Hardin-Simmons University in September 1994 and spanned the next 27 years, which is nearly 3 decades. Much like Viktor Frankl, who was very impressed by Sigmund Freud's poise when he encountered him by accident on the streets of Vienna in the latter part of 1924 or early 1925, as he remembered, I was stunned by the phenomenal presence of Dr. Barnes since I first met him in July of 1994. During this meeting, Dr. Barnes told me that he pledged the rest of his life to disseminating the work of Dr. Frankl's logotherapy and existential analysis. Knowing that Dr. Barnes kept this promise faithfully to the very last minutes of his earthly life allows me to make some modest comparisons between this historically significant meeting between Viktor Frankl and Sigmund Freud and my encounters with Dr. Barnes that will help to illuminate the nature and the quality of meaning-centered encounters that I hope can offer some inspiration for us in our circumstances to be beacons of hope in our troubled world in need of healing and reconciliation. The learning objectives of these presentations are to, first, highlight the significant existential dynamics involved in fostering meaning orientation. Second, to draw attention to the role of meaning-oriented intergenerational encounters in human growth and development. Ultimately, my presentation aims to highlight ways in which meaning orientation can help us to face tragedies with hope, faith, and tragic optimism, through which a human person can rise from being defeated, can grow from being deformed by adversities into a callous and indifferent person, to being reformed into the image of ultimate values and transformed into a loving human being. The first part of this presentation will review new archival findings about the meeting of Viktor Frankl and Sigmund Freud that suggest that engagements where individuals are genuinely willing to de-reflect from themselves and offer their presence to others in a spirit of welcoming and solidarity are conductive to learning about each other, learning from each other, and transcending physical, social, and psychological barriers toward meaning that is waiting to be actualized, experienced, and eternalized. The second part will continue to highlight the capacities of the defiant power of the human spirit as a healing and life-giving inner resource and the hallmark of meaning-centered encounters, the kind of meeting that I was privileged to have with Dr. Barnes. Meeting someone whom we admire in person, in addition to hearing or reading about them, can enrich our sense of knowing them. In the context of an encounter, new levels of insight can lead to the discovery of something yet unknown. The truth can emerge in yet unseen or unperceived sublime ways, revealing new horizons of meaning. In this process, we can learn something about ourselves. According to Dr. Joseph Fabry, self-discovery is one of the guideposts to finding meaning. Within the context of meaning-centered encounter, self-discovery can be fostered not only by focusing on one's feelings, thoughts, and response to a situation, but by reflecting away from the self and observing, listening to, noticing, and honoring the way someone else has dealt with or is dealing with challenging situations or difficulties. Thus, by being present to those who are burdened by emotional, physical, or social or spiritual challenges, and then using this insight, reviewing and previewing our own lives, and reflecting on the process of our becoming, the freedom that we have and that belongs to us to shape and mold ourselves and to build ourselves as we reach out to others, can be helpful in our growth and development. Mignon Eisenberg stated that from the bitter can come forth the sweet, when we can move from self-centeredness to self-transcendence, when we can stop feeling victimized and discover a source of strength and the freedom within oneself, within ourselves, to choose how we are going to respond to hardships. She paraphrased Frankl, expressing the belief that suffering and trouble belong to life as much as faith and death. None of these can be subtracted from life without destroying its meaning. To subtract trouble, death, faith, and suffering from life would mean stripping life from its own shape. Only under the hammer blows of faith, in the white heat of suffering, does life gain shape and form. Research indicates that historical sources of meaning can be derived from reflecting first on what we received from life, the life that was given to us. Second, what we choose to make out of ourselves, the life that we choose to live. And third, the legacy that we want to leave through actualizing values, what we want to live, and most importantly, to leave in the world for eternity. This ever-present option to change oneself and to transform life's tragedies into personal and human achievements appears to be the greatest challenge and the message that can counteract despair. It invites us to realize that in the process of becoming and molding ourselves, in the process of making the best of what is given to us and accomplishing the meaning that we are called upon to actualize, each in our own and unique circumstances, we are not alone. We have a source of strength inside us, which, like a fountain of inner power, can be mobilized and called upon, and which connects us with a reality far greater and far nobler than ourselves. At this point, it would be helpful, as Frankl quoted Kant, to perform a Copernican revolution, a conceptual turn through 180 degrees, after which the question can no longer be, what can I expect from life, but can only be, what does life expect from me? What task is waiting for me? Thus the question arises, which type of encounters help us to realize that we have strength within? And how do encounters help us to realize that we have strength within? How do we nurture our strength within? As you recall, in Say Yes to Life in Spite of Everything, Viktor Frankl noted that living itself means nothing other than being questioned. Our whole act of being is nothing more than responding to and being responsible toward life. And Frankl continued to explain that with this mental standpoint, nothing can scare us anymore. No future, no apparent lack of future, because now the present is everything, as it holds the eternally new question that life offers for us. Now everything depends on what is expected of us, and that what awaits us in the future, we don't need to know any more than we are able to know it. A chance meeting between Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, and Viktor Frankl, the founder of logotherapy and existential analysis, occurred in the winter of 1924 or early in the spring of 1925. At the time, Freud was 68 years old and an internationally renowned scholar. Frankl was 19 years old, and he had just started his first year of medical school at the University of Vienna, where Freud was one of the professors. Observing the age difference between Freud and Frankl, which is nearly 50 years, and that they met each other in person for the duration of no longer than a few minutes, one could hypothesize that the meeting was random and its impact fleeting and inconsequential. Yet, upon further examination, we may discover that nothing can be further away from the truth. The meeting was an intergenerational encounter with a lasting impact. What distinguished this chance encounter from a casual meeting, and what made it so significant? What makes an encounter meaningful, and why does this matter in today's world? The significance of our present study is accentuated by current trends. We live in a digital age where contact can be established at the click of a button. Distance in miles can be bridged in seconds. Communication can be extended from all corners of the world into space. Yet, the amount of loneliness, distress, and alienation is worrisome. The number of people suffering from depression, anxiety, and stress-related problems is alarming. The rate of indifference and lack of regard is concerning. According to David Dozoa and the mental health research team in Canada, since the start of the pandemic, the rate of anxiety experienced by people has increased fourfold. Its prevalence rose from 5% to 20% in the general population. The rate of depression has doubled. From 4% it rose to 10%. Increments in the prevalence of the symptoms of anxiety and depression have been reported around the world during the pandemic. It appears then that it is not the quantity or the speed of our communication that makes it meaningful, but rather the quality that can make a difference. A short description of Frankl's meeting with Freud was recorded in Frankl's book Recollections, as well as in his official autobiography. At the request of Kurt Eisler, a psychoanalyst, the founder and the executive director of the Freud Archives, a detailed personal account of this meeting was tape-recorded by Dr. Frankl in his home in 1950. In 1951, the interview was transcribed and deposited in the Freud Archives in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. Since 2015, this record has been available to the public in Dr. Frankl's native language, and the event was narrated in his original and beautiful Austrian dialect. Since 2017, the document could be accessed online. The author's free translation of excerpts from this text were published with permission from the Eisler estate in a book entitled Care and Consolation: The Doctor Who Saved Lives, which is currently available on Amazon. Historical facts that help to understand and to underscore the context of this encounter are also elaborated on in greater details in this recent book. From reviewing social, political, economic, personal, and professional factors that influenced Sigmund Freud's life in the early 1920s, we could gain a comprehension that while to the outsider Sigmund Freud was known as an international authority, he suffered tremendously in his personal life. He suffered several losses in his family, and his own ill health made him increasingly frail. After the death of one of his nephews, who was only 5 years old, for example, Sigmund Freud wrote, "I do not think I have ever experienced such grief. Perhaps my own sickness contributes to the shock. I work out of sheer necessity. Fundamentally, everything else has lost its meaning for me." Despite several significant losses and grief, Freud kept carrying a full caseload, and he set himself a grueling 10 to 12-hour workday with back-to-back appointments to earn enough money to support his family. Thanks to his efforts of contributing to the treatment of shell shock from the psychoanalytic point of view after the First World War, which earned him governmental support and he placed him in the center of attention, thanks to his publications and innovative ideas, Sigmund Freud was promoted to professor at the University of Vienna in 1919. However, he continued to face significant challenges both personally and professionally, most of which were hidden from the public eye. The young Frankl grew up appreciating Freud's intellectual brilliance. By 1924 and 1925, there was an aura surrounding Freud's persona. In 1924, soon after his graduation from high school, Viktor Frankl wrote to Professor Freud, inquiring if he could join the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. His first paper on mimicking affirmation and negation, which he sent to Freud earlier, had been published that year in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. Freud answered with a postcard urging him to set up an appointment to see Paul Federn, the secretary of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. Paul Federn gave an appointment and met Viktor Frankl in his office. He was impressed by Frankl's objectivity and professionalism, but yet suggested to continue to devote his undivided attention to the completion of his medical studies and, in addition, to undertake training analysis. Frankl was very perplexed. On the one hand, he was drawn to psychoanalysis more than to individual psychology. On the other hand, the individual psychologists were setting up child guidance clinics all over Vienna to offer practical hands-on services to large numbers of at-risk children and youth. The number of suicides was high, and he was trying to find feasible ways of using his skills to participate in these efforts. Embarking on his medical studies at the University of Vienna, the 20-year-old Frankl was in the leadership of the Academic Society for Medical Psychology. In this capacity, he was the contact person between Sigmund Freud and the Academic Society. He recalls that whenever something arose, I had to go to the home of Freud, but I never saw him. I was never invited further than the reception room, both in reality and figuratively speaking. While Frankl was already involved with Alfred Adler's group, he went one day coming from the University District down the Universitätsstraße, University Street, and crossing over to the Votive Park. He says, I was at the last block by the Schottentor of the Votive Park when an elderly gentleman crossed my path. An old man with a white goatee, wearing an old, colorless, grey, shabby, worn-out hat and a long coat that was at that time called a havelock. It was a dark green coat paired with a black walking stick with a silver grip. And I thought to myself, is this man trying to imitate Sigmund Freud? But the expression on the face and the overall impression did not look like, an old temple server trying to dress or act like Sigmund Freud. Seeing the face, Frankl could recognize it from the photographs. He explained that he had this habit of cutting out photos from newspapers and gluing the pictures into books to match the author's likeness to their writings. He had the ability to recall and to recreate someone's face from memory. Since he was a schoolboy, he had this keen ability to capture the key features of a face, and he practiced it while daydreaming during boring geography and literature classes when he had drawn the faces of Adler and Freud into his notebook. The physiognomy for me is quite prosaic, he said, and I thought, this must be Freud. To test his hypothesis, he observed the man from closer. I went a bit further and I saw how the man, had his teeth bare and he was moving his jaw. Then he recalled that he heard that Freud had a prosthesis of the jaw. It was seemingly bothering him, but I had the sure impression that he was also talking to himself. Following him, he observed that Freud was gesticulating in a nervous kind of way, and he was also talking to himself as he paced the pavement with his stick. He gave a totally autistic and totally self-absorbed impression, said Frankl. So he started to doubt his hypothesis. I thought to myself, this cannot be Sigmund Freud. In his imagination, he started to imagine that maybe this was just an old gentleman who was maybe living alone. He was a bit distracted, angrily pounded the pavement on his way to somewhere. One cannot. It was not. Yet, the gesture was such an obvious expression. Maybe it was Sigmund Freud. Who else could it be? So Frankl says, I thought to myself, now I'm curious. Simply, if he turns to Berggasse, then it's him. When he only walks toward Berggasse, it may not be a proof. Clearly, Frankl went about testing his hypothesis in a scientific way. I followed the man, step by step, until the corner of Ehringerstrasse and Berggasse, says Frankl. In other words, I became a follower of Frankl. He continued like this, following the elderly gentleman at a steady pace for a few meters until, he turns to Berggasse, right? Frankl decided to make a decisive move at this moment. He says, at that point, I stepped in front of him and I said, excuse me, do I have the honor to speak to Herr Professor Freud? And he said, yes. And I said, my name is Viktor Frankl, Vienna, 2nd District, Zenningasse 6, door 25. Freud, since he had 2 years of correspondence and seemingly aware that Frankl was now with the Alfred Adler's group, seemed to remember. Then Frankl flew forth. Excuse me if I disturb you. This may not be relevant, but I thought to myself that I would like to take this opportunity to tell you something. This summer, I had a chance to read a book by Lalande, a French author, about the death instinct, and I thought that it may interest you, if I may be allowed to draw your attention to it. After 20 years, this short conversation was so vivid in Frankl's mind that he could recall every word of it. And he says, yes, that interests me. Yes, of course. Could you please make a short review of it in an essay with the reference? I would publish it in the Imago. This was it. The dialogue lasted only a few minutes. I could not say what else I spoke about. I only remember the impression I got. The impression was immensely deep. I was actually shocked, says Frankl. For one, it would have been hard to reestablish the connection with Freud and to publish in the Imago once he was involved in the individual psychologist, obviously. Just the thought of it sent the shivers down his spine. He says, I had the goosebumps all over me. this was his only long-awaited personal meeting with Sigmund Freud. Why was Frankl shocked by the encounter? Well, for several reasons. Fortunately, we do not have to speculate, for he explains them in the rest of the interview. Firstly, Frankl was intensely affected because of Freud and Adler's statue in the Viennese circles, especially among the youth. In his recollections, he states in this interview that he recorded, "This is Sigmund Freud, one of these gods. Freud and Adler, these were the gods. My generation and the speck of my generation who grew up in the second district of the Prater Quarter. It was at that time, at least during my high school years, when from evening until midnight we were hanging out in friendly circles, and the main topics were Marxism, communism, socialism, or individual psychology, or psychoanalysis, Freud or Adler, Marx or Lenin. Those were the highlights of the discussion and the main points, and those were our gods, our demigods, or two demigods, Freud and Adler." The second reason why Frankl was stunned was because of the contrast between the demeanor of Adler and Freud. Adler was instantly expressive, usually jovial and warm. At the Café Siller, for example, where the individual psychologists met, Adler would greet Frankl with a loud and unmistakable "Frankl! Thank God!" and vigorously shake his hand, inviting to come and take a seat. And how much he loved that gesture. If one could choose only two words to capture his impression of Freud, he would have used only two words, he says. Just these two words: grace and sophistication. Both characteristics were so compelling and so overwhelming. And in Frankl's experience, both attributes so different from Adler, who, he says, I do not want to say posed, but forced and oozed joviality. Freud stood there quite simple, distanced, distinguished, but at the same time without any pretense from the way people spoke about him. Let us say that he stood at an anxious distance to keep people from loving him? No. Not at all. Just out of simplicity. He needed no gestures, no pose, like Adler, whom I loved so much. But the more this contrast really impressed me in the character of these two men, this simplicity, this lack of posing, this sophistication, this actual, real, honest stillness without any unnecessary word. Despite, as I have often tried to explain, and please do not misunderstand me, says Frankl, I'm not trying to talk about being meritorious, the content of his wisdom, or holding others in contempt, or so on, which are qualities that I could not see anything good about. None of this was present at all, other than this simple, humble, sophisticated openness and readiness. Not an unnecessary word, but what he did say was sincere and open. I do not know if I can express here correctly, says Frankl. The essence of what he wanted to say was this. There one sees a man who is curiously, nervously pacing, appears to be conducting a dialogue with himself, or obviously talking to himself, gesticulating in worn clothing. And one thinks to himself, oh, for God's sake, this cannot be Sigmund Freud. Finally, he turns to Bergasse. From these clues, one identifies him as Freud, speaks to him, and awakened from his thoughts. And out of his thoughts, he turns to you in openness. You know, this openness, straightness, simplicity, sophistication, qualities that you cannot enforce, you cannot force. This is what impressed me. This is what shocked me, says Frankl. So which are the characteristics of meaning-centered encounters, meaningful encounters, that we can infer from this short account? First of all, that meaningful encounters entail openness to the other in the present moment. There was something else that Frankl adds at the end of the interview that is a final, and we could say logotherapeutic observation. This frail elderly gentleman, who was Sigmund Freud, in an ill body, but ready to distance himself from his pain and turn in open welcome towards something that confronts him, someone who greets him unexpectedly. He turns to the young student who addresses him, giving him his full and undivided attention, and for a few moments he forgoes his physical pain, his discomfort, and his worries, and he's totally present to the moment and the task of the moment. The second point is that the unconditional man refers to the healthy core of the person. The striking image of Professor Freud on the streets of Vienna in his simple elegance and grace contradicts all the reductionist theories that claim that life force stems from the body and vitality is equal to bare physical or mental well-being. As we see Freud in front of our inner eyes, we are witnessing that he's teaching us something sublime, barely perceptible, yet something so significant. How false is each ideology that thinks that the organism makes the spirit of life, or time makes the man who we see in front of us, says Frankl. Sigmund Freud keeps his dignity, keeps his composure, keeps himself together, there on the street, devoid of all pretenses, preparation, or deceit. He has a will to life up to a point where time does no longer make the man, but man shapes time and co-creates. Isn't that so? Says Frankl. We see that Sigmund Freud, despite everything, chose to bear himself this way or that way. He chose in his area of freedom, the area of his intact spirit, to defy all his physical illness and frailty, transcend the pain of his aching body and worried mind, and welcome this young man who demanded his attention. He chose to do so out of his free will, out of his openness and readiness to welcome the meaning of the moment. The third point is that the essence of human existence is self-transcendence. There are many lenses through which one could examine this encounter. From a reductionist point of view, one could say Frankl acted as a subservient young man who honored Freud as an introjected father figure out of fear of punishment. Or one could say Frankl was looking for acceptance and affirmation while he was lacking it. How much more simple, honest, and to the point it would be to say that Frankl approached Freud with respect and that he was impressed by him. This last statement matches his own words. And he says, in hindsight, this is not the impression, but the expression and the example known as Sigmund Freud that is captured in my experience during this brief encounter that occurred 30 years ago. It is worthwhile to mention that the recording was prepared with the idea that in 100 years, if someone will be interested, it will be released to the public, and hopefully at that time, one can make something out of it. Well, it is a blessing that we have this recording available. The fourth point is that a living legacy is transmitted through meaningful encounters. At first instance, the story of the meeting between the elderly and frail Sigmund Freud and the young and energetic Viktor Frankl may resonate with similar instances where a meeting between a significant mentor and their former student was recorded. More recent example, for example, Mitch Albom's Tuesdays with Maury, an old man, a young man, and life's greatest lessons may come to mind. Only here we have a snapshot of a historically significant moment in the evolution of psychotherapy. For as Frankl remarked, the place of Freud in the history of psychotherapy is irreplaceable. In the oldest synagogue of the world, Prague's medieval Alt-Neue synagogue, the guide shows visitors the seat once occupied by the famous Rabbi Löw. It has never been taken over by any of his successors. For them, another seat was set up. Because Rabbi Löw could never be replaced, no one could match him, and for centuries, no one was allowed to sit in this seat. The chair of Freud should also be kept empty. Needless to say, and useful to mention, that Rabbi Löw was one of the ancestors of Viktor Frankl that we know from his recollections. One can only experience a deep-felt gratitude at the recording of this experience, which happened now close to 100 years ago. As Frankl remarked, nothing that we have experienced, nothing that we have witnessed or courageously suffered can be removed from the face of this earth. For what we brought into reality will remain and radiate into the world. In his words, what we radiate into the world, the waves that emanate from our being, that is what will remain of us when our being has long passed away. Although Frankl and Freud's background, life experience, and theoretical formulations widely diverged, there was a common ground, a common meeting point at which they converged. Today, as it was in the past, this common denominator is the wish of all psychotherapists to alleviate human suffering, and if that is not possible, to help us face our faith with courage and dignity. Standing on the shoulders of giants, logotherapy contends that life has meaning until the last breath, and even in the most miserable situation, meaning can be found. The example illustrates that it is not necessary to become a logotherapist to discern meaning and to radiate courage and dignity. However, individuals who choose to rise to the heights of human potential can have a long-lasting logotherapeutic impact on their surroundings. Age or time cannot erase the impact of the defiant power of the human spirit. Its effect is healing, wholesome, and timeless. And now to my personal memories with Dr. Barnes. First, with a brief historical context. In 1991, my family and I left the war-torn former Yugoslavia. We were part of a Hungarian-speaking minority there. My father was a psychiatrist and former student of Viktor Frankl in Vienna. On my father's side, my family had Jewish roots. My paternal grandfather was a survivor of the Holocaust, and my father was hidden at his birth so that he would not be deported to the concentration camps. My great-grandfather held a nobility title issued by Francis Joseph, the Emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This title still applies to all his family and his descendants. My great-grandfather perished in Auschwitz. Several of my relatives also died in Auschwitz or on the way there. Their names are recorded in the Yad Vashem Memorial in Israel, dedicated to the victims of the Holocaust. I was oblivious to all this when I was 16 years old and first read Man's Search for Meaning in Germany at my parents' insistence. The past was not talked about outside the family for fear of retribution from the communist authorities. Inside the family, my grandfather talked only on certain occasions. Thus, I read Man's Search for Meaning when I was 16 years old in Freiburg, Germany, while I studied German at the Goethe Institute during the summer of 1988, and this book instantly became my best companion. It resonated with me. It felt as if the words in this book expressed all the emotions and all the experiences and reflected what my grandfather did not articulate with words or could not articulate with words. In 1990 and 1991, I had just finished secondary school of nursing with a diploma in nursing and completed my first year of university education at the Loránd Eötvös University in Budapest and the Péter Pázmány Academy of Theology in Hungary. As soon as I arrived home for the summer holiday that year in 1991, my parents informed me that they are planning to go on an extended holiday, just never to return to their home. I took the first train to Hungary and my parents packed our belongings into 7 suitcases, 1 per person. They crossed the border the following day and for the next 2 months our motorhome was our home. In July 1991 we received the visas and purchased the plane tickets to Calgary in Canada. After a few months my parents were able to afford their first home, a small house with 4 bedrooms and their first car. It was past the application deadline to continue my studies at the University of Calgary in that year, so I had a gap year, during which I passed the driving test and worked in home care as a nursing attendant. The following year I got accepted to continue my studies in psychology and finished a bachelor's degree with first-class honors in 1993. My father wrote to Dr. Elizabeth Lucas, whom he was regularly in touch with through his work as a psychiatrist, to inquire where in North America one could study logotherapy. Dr. Lucas recommended to contact Dr. Robert Barnes, who was then the newly elected president of the Viktor Frankl Institute in the United States. We phoned Dr. Barnes, and he said that there was only one requirement before being accepted to study at Hardin-Simmons University, and that was to have an interview with him. Dr. Barnes gave me an appointment in July of 1994, and after this meeting, I could start my studies in Abilene in September of 1994. I landed at Abilene Regional Airport at the end of August 1994. Dr. Dorothy, Dr. Barnes' wife, waited for me at the airport, and she drove me to the dormitories in her car. It was a splendid and exciting experience. A few days after settling in, the first class took place. It was a gorgeous, mild September afternoon. About 20 students gathered in the assigned classroom where our first class was going to take place. It was on the history of the theory of counseling and psychotherapy. Dr. Barnes arrived very cheerfully, followed by his graduate assistant who carried a stack of photocopied articles and deposited them on his desk. When everyone took their seats, Dr. Barnes introduced himself and he asked us all to call him Dr. Bob. Then he explained that in his class, the chairs are not going to be arranged in rows as we were so accustomed to sitting before, but we are going to shift them into a semicircle, depending on the number of students, so that we can all see each other and interact with each other whenever we want to, with a slight inclination between the 2 adjacent chairs, so that one could avoid the direct gaze if one wanted to, and yet one could still comfortably talk, much like you would set up a counseling office as well, explained Dr. Bob. The class continued with introductions. Dr. Bob seemed to be already familiar with most of the students, and he asked them questions about their jobs, their family, or other details that made them comfortable to open up. There was a routine in Dr. Bob's class that I did not encounter anywhere else. and that was that he never started class without greeting everyone else one by one in person, with his scooter going from person to person in a clockwise or counterclockwise direction, and expressing his thanks and gratitude that they were there. It made each one of us feel appreciated and valued. In Dr. Bob's class, everyone mattered, and no person was just a name or a number. To be his student meant to learn about the value and dignity of each person, regardless of their background. The first lecture was accompanied by a film that Dr. Bob showed us from the life of Sigmund Freud. It was unforgettable to me because in the setting and the characters I could almost revisit my childhood home, the tapestries we had in the living room, the richly decorated walls, the formal atmosphere. I had the goosebumps all over me, knowing that my ancestors came from the same place and the same people group as that of Sigmund Freud and Viktor Frankl, the Jews of Moravia, who wandered across centuries and millennia since the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and who faced persecution, pogroms, and discrimination wherever they went. The story of my ancestors started to reach my conscious awareness then, and I felt very strongly that I was very privileged and blessed to be in the company of the other students and Dr. Bob, and to be able to learn about Viktor Frankl and logotherapy and existential analysis. To many of us, Frankl's ideas rekindled feelings of home away from home. A few months later, Dr. Bow asked me if I could accept the position as one of his graduate assistants. He assigned my hours to be between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. My duties consisted of preparing photocopies of articles and lecture notes, which occasionally included Dr. Bob's handouts with his articles or exam questions. But the best part of the assignment was that Dr. Bob had entrusted me to research logotherapy-related articles at the library and to translate a letter that he received from Dr. Lucas with her comments on a recent article. As I mentioned earlier, next to the reception room was Dr. Bob's office, Dr. Dorothy's office, and a smaller one-room library that belonged to the Department of Counseling and Human Development. This library was full of copies of logotherapy books, such as copies of books by Frankl, Lucas, and Fabry, as well as other publications which Dr. Bob had collected for the sake of references to be given away to his students or for being sold at the conferences. It was a place of a small paradise for me to be in this library during hours when no one came into the office, and to read and read while the time seemed to be stopped existing. I literally forgot everything else. Only the books existed in those moments and those people who wrote them. That room for me was like a time machine, where you could get transported into the realm of the soul, and soul far above and beyond the confines of the office walls. Dr. Bob understood how much I loved these books. When the new edition of the favorite book, The Pursuit of Meaning, came out, he gave me a copy with the inscription, "To Maria Ungár, our very special student, to whom God gave a magnificent potential for helping others to find meaning." Another book, Viktor Frankl's Psychotherapie in Praxis, was there on the shelf since he received this book from Dr. Lucas, but he could not read it in German, so he gifted me with this book. Dr. Bob regularly spoke to me about logotherapists around the world and their activities, and his high hopes for the first International Congress on Logotherapy that he was organizing as the president of the Viktor Frankl Institute in the United States. This Congress, the 10th World Congress on Logotherapy, was dedicated to Professor Frankl in honor of his 90th birthday. The announcement for the Congress stated, "While the international scientific and educational community have bestowed significant honors upon Professor Frankl, it is in the grateful hearts of mankind that he has truly earned immortality." Unable to travel to the United States because of health, Dr. Frankl and his beloved wife, Mrs. Dr. Eleanor Frankl, have sent their precious emissaries, granddaughter Katarina Frankl-Vesely and grandson Alexander Frankl-Vesely, to be with us. We are grateful for this generous and loving gift. In it informed participants of the fact that although Dr. Frankl by that time, this was 1995, was not able to be physically present at the Congress, he was there in spirit. Dr. Elizabeth Lucas, Dr. Joseph Fabry, Dr. Robert Leslie, Dr. Edith Eva Egger, Dr. Jerry Long, Dr. J.I. Levinson, Dr. Bianca Hirsch, Dr. James Crumbo, Dr. Rosemary Henrion, Dr. Mignon Eisenberg, and many other iconic teachers and therapists gathered from around the world to welcome Katya and Alex and to offer a splendid and rich content. I was also present at this Congress offering a presentation entitled Healing Through Meaning, and my father, Dr. Paul Ungár, was also present with a thought-provoking presentation on functions of purpose and functions of existence. Months of excited preparation took place before the Congress, and the incoming and outgoing mail and the phone calls filled the office with times when the amount of work and the pile of envelopes never seemed to end. There was a joyful expectation of planning and preparing ourselves for this wonderful event of the meeting of kindred spirits. At this Congress, I met Katya and Alex, who represented their grandfather. Since this meeting, there has been a special respect for Katya and Alex in my heart. At that time, I did not know that 20 years earlier, Dr. Frankl had written a letter of recommendation for my father when he was his student in Vienna. Had I known that, I would have said, "Thank you from the bottom of my heart to Katya and Alex in person." That letter, although only a one-page document, is evidence that Viktor Frankl cared about the fate of my family and wanted to help us to immigrate to a better place. I was now in a safer place. I was in the company of his grandchildren. That short letter proved very efficient. The post-Congress workshop was held by Dr. Lucas. As you recall, Dr. Lucas recommended to study with Dr. Barnes, and now we had a wonderful opportunity to reconnect. Dr. Bob also attended every presentation of Dr. Lucas. He took careful notes and shared every word he learned with his students in class. Nothing that Dr. Lucas said during the Congress did not escape his attention, and he occasionally asked questions for clarification and participated in the case studies and role plays. I know this because on one occasion I had to role play with him a scenario from family therapy, where I was the therapist, Dr. Bob was playing the role of a physically challenged husband, and Martha Stavros, a social worker, was playing the role of a discontented wife. At the end of the meaning-oriented dialogue with the couple, under the direction of Dr. Lucas, these two people became reconciled. Another unforgettable experience with Dr. Bob. In December 1995, I finished my studies. In the following year, I was accepted in the doctoral studies of the counseling psychology program of the University of Alberta in Edmonton, closer to my parents' home in Canada. From there, I went to study with Dr. Lucas in Fürstenfeldbruck in Germany in the winter of 2000, and I was invited by Alexander Vesely to offer a presentation at the Polyclinic Hospital. I did not know that many years ago, my father had been invited to offer a presentation at that same location with Dr. Frankl and Paul Polak. In Fürstenfeldbruck, I met Dr. Alexander Batyányi, who was at that time the director of the archives of the Viktor Frankl Institute. We were students in Dr. Lucas's classroom together. It was an unforgettable experience learning from Dr. Lucas, whose curriculum Dr. Frankl described as the cleanest source of logotherapy. Dr. Bob, Dr. Dorothy, and I kept in touch through the next 20-some years. From the time I met my husband, Edward, and moved to Portsmouth in the United Kingdom, where I became lecturer, to the time when we moved to Canada and our first child was born, and the years in which all our 4 other children were born, Dr. Bob never missed to phone for a birthday or our wedding anniversary. We talked about books, authors, events, news, and everything and anything that we wanted to mention to each other that was related to our work in logotherapy. When we settled in Canada, Dr. Bob was pleased with the work of the Ottawa Institute of Logotherapy, and he was hoping to see our 5 boys, our 5 ducklings, as we jokingly said it, walk into a splendid lecture hall one day where he would meet us. We looked forward to this meeting. Dr. Bob was a man with a vision for each of us who got to know him. Several times he stayed after class way into the evening and into the darkening skies when everyone else has already long time ago left. I could still see him from the other end of the campus talking to a student or to someone who sought his advice. He would tell me that when he arrived home, Dr. Dorothy remarked that he looked tired, and then he would reply, Dorothy, and he would say, "My dear Dorothy, I may look tired, but I'm so happy. Today I was able to help someone." He was an absolute believer in the power of meaning that provides strength for a task that was still waiting and for a source of courage in the face of physical and psychological challenges. Dr. Bob's favorite poem was Robert Frost's Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. He often repeated these verses with emphasis. "The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep." He loved organ music because he believed that more than any other instrument, it lifted the human soul into its heights. On his epitaph, he desired to have only one word: servant. He said he said this to all of us in class because at the end he taught us nothing will matter, not the credentials that we held or what honors were bestowed upon us, only the people we loved and the love that we shared, the love that we radiated into the world. And that's all that will count. Dr. Bob pledged all his strength to the service of his students and his clients. And as it was so accurately mentioned in his eulogy, he invested the harvest of his life into his students and the people around him. Viktor Frankl said that each deed is its own monument. Dr. Bob's life was a monument. His dedication to logotherapy, his attitude of service, his generosity and humility are guideposts for values that he lived and tested. Dr. Bob believed that each life situation, even the most difficult experiences, can prepare us to be of help to someone else. In other words, that nothing that happens to us is without meaning, and it is up to us to find the best possible way in which we can actualize meaning that is available up to our last breath. Someone from his congregation remarked, when Bob could no longer use his legs, he grew wings. He grew wings to console, to encourage, and to aid others. He inspired generations of logotherapists and students from all walks of life. He lived his life with meaning up to his last breath. As Frankl would say, his granaries were full of the harvest well collected. Today, as we ponder the relevance of meaning in our troubled world, and we consider the lives and the example of giants on whose shoulders we are privileged to stand, the words of the prophet ring true, the prophet Habakkuk, which are also words from Viktor Frankl's will to meaning. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herds in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. Save one life, save the entire world, is a well-known Jewish saying. Tikkun olam, repairing the world, is the most highly regarded good deed. Dr. Bob did just that. He dedicated his life to repairing the world little by little, one person at a time. His example calls all of us to continue the same task. Zikrono livracha. May his memory be a blessing, and his generous spirit continue to guide and inspire us to do likewise. Viktor Frankl affirmed that to say yes to life is not only meaningful under all circumstances, because life itself is, but it is also possible under all circumstances. The greatness of true giants does not lie in their physical strength, but in the strength of the spirit expressed in measures of kindness, generosity, humility, and wisdom, worthy goals to set for our encounters. In his words, what we achieve by seizing the moment is once and for all rescued into a reality in which it's only apparently cancelled out by becoming the past. In truth, it has actually been preserved, in the sense of being kept safe. Having been, in this sense, is perhaps the safest form of being. The being, the reality that we have rescued into the past in this way, can no longer be harmed by transitoriness. And I repeat it. What we achieve by seizing the moment is once and for all rescued into reality in which it is only apparently cancelled out by becoming the past. In truth, it has actually been preserved, in the sense of being kept safe. Having been in this sense is perhaps the safest form of being. The being, the reality that we have rescued into the past in this way, can no longer be harmed by transitoriness. Thank you for your attention.